Deep in the interior of western Newfoundland lies a high, barren plain, the Buchans Plateau. Somewhere out there is a herd of 2,000 caribou, just settling down after their long spring migration from the south coast. We wanted to see them, so we too made a trek to the Buchans Plateau. I'm Dave Quinton. For me, it was partly a sentimental journey, back to the country I'd camped in for 2 springs while with the Wildlife Service.
I'm Wilf Dyke. It was my first time on the Buchans Plateau, and after a long, hard winter, it was good to be able to hike to a part of Newfoundland I'd never seen before, and maybe see a few caribou.
Still, I was a bit anxious as Wilf scanned the horizon that first morning. Would the animals be there? Sure enough, there they were, a small group of caribou grazing on the tender young spring growth. Now, Wilf is a man who likes to know where he is all the time. If I were a full-blooded Beothuk Indian, he'd still want to examine the topographic sheet.
Well, it was new country to me, and I was curious about the lie of the land, the broad valley that gives birth to the Shannon-Didit River and other nameless rivers that eventually feed Star Lake and Red Indian Lake, and away in the distance the wrinkled range of mountains that carry the old Micmac name, Aniopsquatch. Hunters fly into parts of the plateau for a few weeks in the fall, most of them mainland and American sportsmen in search of trophy caribou. For the rest of the year, the plateau is left alone, a quiet highland refuge for the caribou and the Arctic hare. And I was anxious to see it, for there's not much wild country left anymore, even here in Newfoundland.
Barren country, the Buchans Plateau, barren but beautiful nevertheless in its own wild, primitive way, with its blend of Arctic and subarctic plants, many of them quite rare in Newfoundland, found only on our highest mountains. Others, such as the ground juniper, a familiar sight on most of our barrens. Then, a chance discovery, the provincial flower of Nova Scotia, the Mayflower, growing out here in the mountains of western Newfoundland. I'd always figured this was a lowlands plant growing on rich bottomland soil further south. Certainly it's not found in eastern Newfoundland, and here it's prospering at 2,100 feet, in flower on the last day of May. Guess it just made it. It seems strangely out of place out here amidst the Arctic plants and the primitive lichens that are still struggling to blanket the rocky outcrops of the Buchans Plateau.
One of the problems the vegetation faces has got to be the wind. The further up we climbed, the stronger it got. It's no place for a sombrero. The caribou weren't on the hills anyway, so we dipped into the valley once again. The valley cuts a broad path into the plateau from the south, and the animals seem to prefer it. We were just as glad, for down there the gale became a gentle spring breeze. A small group of it too, if I just walked 100 miles through forest and icy rivers and over bogs and mountains. A bit ragged at this time of the year. But then I suppose I'd look a bit ragged.
Yearlings with a few older deer and fawns. They didn't seem to notice us, or if they did, they didn't seem to care. Of course, the yearlings didn't have to be all that wary. They had no fawns to protect, only their adolescent appetites to worry about. The cagey old deer were the ones to watch.
Well, it was the first time I'd seen caribou in the spring. Their winter coats are starting to shed, and it makes them look a bit... Everyone familiar with the barrens knows the ptarmigan, or as we Newfoundlanders call it, the partridge. This is the willow partridge, the bird that's commonly hunted all over Newfoundland. Here on the plateau, it frequents the lower elevations, leaving the rocky hilltops to the rock partridge. This is a male, anxious to lead us away from his mate, who's incubating a clutch of eggs somewhere nearby. He looks harmless, that big thing in the red coat, but just to be on the safe side,
it wasn't long before we were among the caribou again, a mottled crew of does and calves with a liberal sprinkling of yearlings and 2-year-olds. The long winter months of pawing through the snow for food on the hills of the southwest coast has left them somewhat lean. They're changing their diet now from lichens to the tender young sedges and leafy plants that are just beginning to sprout. Most of the does were heavy with fawn on the long migration. They arrive here on the plateau just in time to give birth. Fawns are born out in the open, on the bogs and barrens, all in the space of a 2-week period, beginning about May 20th. Soon this valley will be one big nursery. It's only a matter of hours, at best a day or two though, and the baby caribou can do a pretty good job of keeping up with the old lady. May and June are eventful months in the life of the caribou. Migration, change of diet, loss of antlers, bolting of winter hare, birthing of calves. No wonder they retreat to this backcountry.
a fire swept through here many years ago, and the sun and the wind and the frost lost no time in picking bare the bones of the trees. Most of their skeletons stand there yet, in form as they grew, twisted and gnarled. Some of them, though, grew surprisingly well, like this white pine we found in the heart of the valley.
The caribou is the only species of deer in which the females may have antlers. While stags and barren does are in velvet at this time of year, does with fawns have small but hard and sharp antlers, which drop off when the fawns are hardy. Could it be nature's way of protecting the young? If so, why do so many females go around without any antlers at all? And why does the percentage of antlered females increase as you move north?
Well, before we go anywhere else, I've got an appointment with some trout. We walked over to a small pond with hopes of catching enough for breakfast the next morning. Looking at the map of the plateau area, these waters flow into Star Lake and eventually Red Indian Lake. And in theory, they're the spawning areas for the huge fish found there. Well, I tied on a choice fly, which I considered deadly for these virgin waters, and with great care, presented it across the eddy of a small run-in. I had visions of a large, prize-winning brook trout boiling after that fly, striking and running deep and jerking violently to shake the barb. Cast after cast produced nothing, only small, not even pan-sized fish, and strangely, not too many of these. Maybe it was too early in the season, or perhaps there was too little feed from the barren ground.
Well, Wilf was good for the rest of the day. Good chance for me to poke around some more. There are pockets of snow here in the high country, sometimes until midsummer. This patch was 8 feet thick, but I recall one hard-packed drift 10 feet thick on the 10th of June, last time I walked this country. There's variety galore in the plant life here on the plateau. Remains of a giant pine 1 minute, Arctic flowers the next, and wherever you go there are lichens, primitive plants, yet oftentimes with a strange, ultra-modern beauty. Lichens are the mainstay of caribou in the wintertime, especially the clumps of cladonia that often carpet the barrens and bogs of the interior. Then, unannounced and unexpected, came the sound of a helicopter to shatter my communion with the lichens. It had to be the boys of the Wildlife Service. They fly over the herds of caribou every spring to count the calves and see how the herd is faring. The helicopter is now an essential part of wildlife studies. A couple of men in one of these machines can do in a few hours work that would take weeks to do on foot. I'd worked with Bruce Porter and Lloyd Russell years before, in the pioneer days of caribou management. They've been keeping close check on the Buchans herd ever since, so this was a great chance to find out more about the main body of the herd and to compare notes on the caribou. They told me the caribou were a bit further to the north this year. They'd already classified and counted most of the herd and had to beat it back to camp before dark. I was convinced the caribou were a lot wilder than they used to be, but my buddies left me there alone on the barrens with the discomforting reminder that maybe the caribou hadn't changed, maybe I was a bit slower than I used to be. Did I say buddies? I mean ex-buddies.
The soft mountain mists of early morning cast an eerie spell on the only pocket of woods for miles around. Trees, cobwebbed, dripping with dew, and bearded with their own varieties of lichens, made us feel we were in a tropical swamp. Certainly, it was hard to believe we were on the roof of Newfoundland, in subarctic caribou country. We first planned on camping, but then we decided to take a chance in an old abandoned cabin. Well, it would be ideal if the bears hadn't wrecked it or storms leveled it, and if we could find it. Well, find it we did, rough and ready, but still intact. We slept like the dead, and in the morning some fancy work with tin cans and wire, well, we even managed to strap up the old stove and get that humming. There was no shortage of wood in this pocket of spruce and fir, so while I swung the hatchet, Dave made the tea, with water as cold and as sweet and as pure as you'll find anywhere. In fact, we had our own mountain spring right in front of the camp door. The mist lingered most of the morning, and we made the most of it. When you're not used to traveling hard all day in caribou country, a few hours of lying about camp can do a lot to recharge your batteries. And so we whittled away the misty morning, waiting for the sun to climb and burn away the clouds that had settled on the plateau.
ramblings the day before apparently hadn't disturbed the animals too much, nor did our smoke. For when the mist did finally lift, there were the caribou, just a few hundred yards from the cabin. But the wildlife men had said we were still on the southern edge of the herd, so we moved on further north. Then, crossing a ridge, we ran into our first rock ptarmigan. A grayer, slightly smaller bird than the willow partridge we'd seen the day before. Here on the plateau, the rock partridge frequents only the mountaintops. It's even tamer than the willow partridge and depends more heavily upon its camouflage. Little wonder, there's no bushes to hide behind up here. Soon we were down in the valley again, by a river which isn't even named on the map. Never did water taste sweeter than here on the plateau, still fed by patches of last winter's snow. It was strong, icy, clear, almost as good as the spring by the cabin. But while the sight of the cool mountain stream made me thirsty, it made Wilf positively feverish. Now there's got to be fish here. But once again, a virgin stream refused to yield to the old pro. Beans for supper again tonight, Wilf, my son.
Well, we'd now worked our way north and east to where the main herd was supposed to be, and sure enough, the familiar white dots scattered over the countryside were caribou, an assortment of old does and young yearlings and fawns. There were caribou everywhere. It was good to see the herd building up. We've decimated the caribou so badly in the past that for a while they seemed on the verge of extinction. The season, in fact, was closed for a long while. In 1961, there were only 6,000 caribou on the whole island. Now there's 2,000 in the Buchans herd alone, and this is one of our smallest herds. Altogether, there's estimated to be 17,000 caribou now roaming the open country.
The stags were still somewhere to the south. They take their time in the spring migration and don't mingle with the does on the maternity ward. The plateau in May and June is strictly female territory.
Caribou don't seem to trust their eyes. Your presence may arouse suspicion, but they'll often settle down again or else circle downwind to get your scent. When they do catch your scent, they can move surprisingly fast, their huge hoofs taking them over bog or snow or rocky ground with equal ease.
If you're really careful and the wind is right, you can get very close to caribou. I've been within 6 feet of young yearlings and once watched someone slap a wild caribou on the rump. But a doe with a calf, well, that's a different matter. as we found when we got too close to this family.
Just when we thought we'd scared the whole herd, a lone doe appeared right in front of us. A snort, a leap in the air, and away she raced. We'd stumbled between her and her calf. He was napping, a cute little fellow a day or so old. Mother had suddenly disappeared, and here were two strange new creatures. And like most wild youngsters, he wasn't really scared of us after the first few moments.
It's at this stage that the lynx preys on the caribou. It doesn't have time to kill, for the mother always rushes to the defense. But it does have time to bite the fawn, and this is eventually fatal, for bacterial infection sets in. The baby caribou dies in a few days. Wildlife men now trap the lynx from the calving grounds. This has greatly increased the caribou's chances of survival. Soon this little fellow adopted us as its new parents, imprinting, the biologists call it. It's happened to me several times before, suddenly finding myself all alone in the wilderness, the adopted mother of a baby caribou, with the real mother nowhere to be seen. It's hard to escape because the baby caribou can soon run as fast as a man, and they simply chase you wherever you go.
Mother, well, the natural mother that is, was circling all the time, keeping a close watch on the situation. It was a trying time for her and for us. She figured we were devouring her baby, while all we wanted to do was get the family reunited. But every time we tried to escape our babysitting chores, the little one followed us. Well, we couldn't sneak away, so we had to run. And run we did as fast as we could go over the barrens. Well, this really caused panic among the rest of the herd, which had been grazing just over the hill. Does were darting about, snorting, sending out youngsters, until finally the whole herd had made tracks up the valley. Watched from the distant hillside, hoping Mother would return to the orphan, and we were worried. Although the doe normally returns in 15 or 20 minutes, but this caribou seemed to have abandoned her little one. An hour passed. We kept watching. The herd settled down, but our little fawn was still alone. 2 hours passed, and then finally, just as we were wondering about taking the little fellow back to camp, Mother returned. We watched them move away over a field of snow.
Well, we didn't want to go through another little drama like that, so we moved up to the high country. Chances of seeing an Arctic hare, one of our rarest animals, were pretty slim. Sure enough, an Arctic hare, the first either of us had ever seen. The Arctic hare lives only in the most remote mountain country of western Newfoundland. Like the rock partridge, it seemed tame. Actually, it's more a matter of the animal depending on its camouflage rather than its legs. With the ears flattened and back humped, it blends in perfectly with the rocky Arctic terrain. Of course, there are no bushes in which to hide up here in the mountains anyway. For 10 minutes or so, we played tin tacks with an Arctic hare. We just had time to make it back to our hotel in the misty woods. We were tired, but we were satisfied. We'd seen the caribou. We'd even become foster parents to a baby caribou for a while. We'd fished and filmed Arctic flowers. We'd talked to the 2 types of ptarmigan, and we'd seen the elusive Arctic hare. But perhaps more than this, we'd proven to ourselves that you don't have to wait for the hunting season to enjoy a trip to the Newfoundland wilderness.